This fairy tale of old China is a love story. It concerns a good young man and the ghost of a beautiful woman long dead, but whom love brought back to life for a while. In a wood fragrant with flowers, the lovers sang old songs, recited ancient poems, and dreamed their dreams. Suddenly, one day, it all came to an end. The spirit of the beautiful woman returned to its abode, and the young man who loved her so deeply lived out his life, never forgetting her, yet never speaking of her even to his children. This is the story of Ming Yi. 500 years ago, in the reign of the Emperor Huang Hu of the Ming Dynasty, there lived in the city of Jiani, the city of Quangkoufu, a man celebrated for his learning and for his piety, whose name was Tian Pilo. This Tian Pilo had one son, a handsome boy who for scholarship and grace and polite accomplishments had no superior among the youths of his age. His name was Ming Yi. When the lad was in his 18th summer, Tian Pilo, his father, was appointed inspector of public instruction at the city of Qingtao, and Ming Yi accompanied his parents there. Near the city of Qingtao lived a rich man of rank, a high commissioner whose name was Chang, who wanted to find a worthy teacher for his children. On hearing of the arrival of the new inspector of public instruction, the noble Chang visited him to obtain advice in this matter, and happening to meet and converse with Pilao's accomplished son, he immediately engaged Ming Yi as a private tutor. The house of this Lord Chang was situated several miles from town, and it was deemed best that Ming Yi should live there. Accordingly, the youth made ready all things necessary for his new sojourn, and his parents bade him farewell, counseling him wisely and citing the words of Lao Tzu and the ancient sages. A beautiful face fills the world with love, but heaven is never deceived thereby. Should you behold a woman coming from the east, look to the west. Should you perceive a maiden approaching from the west, turn your eyes to the east. If Ming Yi did not heed this counsel afterwards, it was only because of his youth and the thoughtlessness of a natural, joyous heart. He departed to abide in the house of Lord Chang. The autumn passed, and the winter also. When the second moon of spring was drawing near, and that happy day, which the Chinese call Hoa Chao, or the birthday of 100 flowers, a longing came upon Ming Yi to see his parents. He opened his heart to the good Chang, who not only gave him permission to go, but also pressed into his hand a gift of 2 ounces of silver. He thought the lad might wish to bring some little memento to his father and mother, since it is the Chinese custom on the feast of Hao Chiu to give presents to friends and relations. That day the air was drowsy with blossom perfume and vibrant with the droning of bees. It seemed to Ming Yi that the path he followed had not been trodden by anyone for many long years. The grass was tall, and vast trees on either side interlocked their mighty and moss-grown arms above him, shadowing the way. But the leafy shadows quivered with bird song, and the deep vistas of the wood were glorified by golden vapors, and as fragrant as a temple with incense. The dreamy joy of the day entered into Ming Yi's heart. He sat down among the flowers, under the branches swaying against the violet sky, to breathe in the perfume and to enjoy the deep, sweet silence. Suddenly a sound caused him to look toward a shady place where wild peach trees were in bloom, and he beheld a young woman, beautiful as the pink blossoms themselves, trying to hide among them. Though he looked for a moment only, Ming Yi could not avoid seeing the loveliness of her face. the golden purity of her complexion and the brightness of her long eyes that sparkled under brows as daintily curved as the outspread wings of the silkworm butterfly. Ming Yi at once turned his gaze away and, rising quickly, proceeded on his journey. Yet he felt so embarrassed at the idea of these charming eyes peeping at him through the leaves that, unaware, he let fall the money he had been carrying in his sleeve. A few moments later, he had heard the patter of light feet running behind him and a woman's voice calling him by name. Turning in great surprise, he saw a comely serving maid. "Sir," she said, "my mistress bade me return to you this silver which you dropped upon the road." Ming Yi thanked the girl gracefully and requested her to convey his compliments to her mistress. Then he proceeded on his way through the perfumed silence and the dreaming shadows of the forgotten path, dreaming himself and feeling his heart beat with strange quickness at the thought of the beautiful being he had seen. And on another day, Ming Yi, returning by the same path, paused once more at the spot where the gracious figure had momentarily appeared before him. This time he was surprised to perceive, through a long vista of immense trees, a dwelling that had previously escaped his notice. A country house, not large, yet elegant. The bright blue tiles of its curved and serrated double roof, rising above the foliage, seemed to blend their color with the luminous azure of the day, and the green and gold designs of its carved porticos were exquisite copies of leaves and flowers bathed in sunshine. At the top of steps leading to a terrace and guarded by great porcelain tortoises, Ming Yi saw the mistress of the house, the idol of his passionate fancy, accompanied by the same serving maid who had carried his message of gratitude. Ming Yi saw that their eyes were upon him. They smiled as if speaking about him, and shy though he was, he found courage to salute the fair lady from a distance. To his astonishment, the young servant beckoned him to approach. Opening a rustic gate, half veiled by trailing plants bearing crimson flowers, Ming Yi mounted to the terrace, with mingled feelings of surprise and joy. As he drew near, the beautiful lady withdrew, but the maid waited at the broad steps to receive him. "Sir," she said, "my mistress understands that you wish to thank her, and she requests you to enter the house, for she knows you already by repute and desires to have the pleasure of bidding you good day." Ming Yi entered bashfully, his feet making no sound upon a matting soft and springy as forest moss, and found himself in a vast reception chamber. A delicious quiet pervaded the house, and shadows of flying birds passed over the strips of light that came through the bamboo blinds. Great butterflies with fiery colored wings found their way in, hovered a moment over the painted vases, and flew out again into the mysterious wood. As noiselessly as they, the young mistress of the mansion entered and kindly greeted the youth, who placed his hands on his breast and bowed low. She was taller than he had thought her, and as slender as a lily. Her black hair was interwoven with the creamy blossoms of the chushaki. Her robes of pale silk took on shifting tints when she moved, as vapors change their hue with the changing light. "If I am not mistaken," she said, when both were seated after having exchanged the customary formalities of politeness, "my honored visitor is none other than Tian Chao, surnamed Ming Yi, educator of the children of my respected relative, the High Commissioner Chang. As the family of Lord Chang is my family also, I cannot but consider the teacher of his children as one of my own kin." "Lady," replied Ming Yi, not a little astonished, "may I dare to inquire the name of your honored family and to ask the relation which you hold to my noble patron?" "The name of my poor family," responded the lady, "is Ping, an ancient family of the city of Qingtao. I am the daughter of Si of Monhio, and Si is also my name. I was married to a young man of the Ping family. By this marriage, I became related to your excellent patron. But my husband died soon after our wedding, and I have chosen this solitary place to live in during my widowhood. There was a drowsy music in her voice, like the melody of brooks and the murmuring of springs, and such a strange grace in her speech as Ming Yi had never heard before. Yet, on learning that she was a widow, the youth did not presume to remain long in her presence without a formal invitation. And after having sipped the cup of tea presented to him, he arose to depart. Si would not suffer him to go so quickly. "No, friend," she said. "Stay yet a little while in my house. I pray, for should your honored patron ever learn that you had been here, and that I had not treated you as a respected guest, I know that he would be greatly angered. Remain at least to supper." Ming Yi remained, rejoicing secretly in his heart, for Si seemed to him the fairest and sweetest being he had ever known, and he felt that he loved her even more than his father and his mother. And while they talked, the long shadows of the evening slowly blended into one violet darkness. The great citron light of the sunset faded, and those starry beings called the three counselors, who preside over life and death and the destinies of men, opened their cold, bright eyes in the northern sky. Within the mansion of Si, the painted lanterns were lighted, the table was laid for supper, and Ming Yi took his place, feeling little inclination to eat and thinking only of the charming face before him. Observing that he scarcely tasted the delicacies on his plate, Si pressed her young guest to have some wine, and they drank several cups together. It was a purple wine, so cool that the cup into which it was poured became covered with vapory dew. Yet it seemed to warm the veins with strange fire. To Ming Yi, as he drank, all things became more luminous, as if enchanted. The walls of the chamber appeared to recede, and the roof to heighten. The lamps glowed like stars in their chains, and the voice of Si floated to the boy's ears like some far-off melody heard through the spaces of a drowsy night. His heart swelled, his tongue loosened, and words fell from his lips that he had thought he could never dare to utter. Yet Si did not restrain him. Her lips did not smile, but her long bright eyes seemed to laugh with pleasure at his praise, and they returned his gaze of passionate admiration with affectionate interest. "I have heard," she said, "of your rare talent and of your many elegant accomplishments. I know how to sing a little, although I cannot claim to any musical learning, and I will lay modesty aside and beg you to sing a few songs with me. It would make me happy if you would condescend to examine my musical compositions." "The honor will be mine, dear lady," Ming Yi replied. "I feel helpless to express my gratitude for so rare a favor." At the summons of a little silver gong, the serving maid brought in the music. Ming Yi took the manuscripts and began to examine them with eager delight. The paper had a pale yellow tint and was light as gossamer, and the characters were beautiful in an antique style, as though they had been traced by the brush of Hai Song Chi Chu himself, the divine genius of ink, who is no bigger than a fly, while the compositions were signed by Yuan Qin, Ko and Tao Mu, mighty poets and musicians of the Tang dynasty. Ming Yi could not repress his delight at the sight of treasures so priceless and unique, and he could scarcely bear to permit them to leave his hands even for a moment. "Oh, lady," he cried, "these are truly priceless, surpassing the treasures of kings. This is indeed the handwriting of the great masters who sang 500 years before our birth. How marvelously it has been preserved. This must be the wondrous ink of which it was written. Ponyin Jiao Qi, I Tian Zhou Qi. After centuries, I remain firm as stone, and my letters remain like lacquer. And how divine the charm of this composition. The song of Cao prince of poets and governor of Shichuan 500 years ago. Cao darling Cao, murmured Si, with a strange light in her eyes. Cao is my favorite also. Dear Ming Yi, let us sing his verses together. To the old melody, the music of those great years, when men were nobler and wiser than today. Their voices rose through the perfumed night like the voices of wonder birds, the feng huang blending together in liquid sweetness. After a time, Ming Yi, overcome by the witchery of his companion's voice, could only listen in speechless ecstasy, while tears of happiness trickled down his cheeks. So the 9th hour passed, and they continued to converse, and to drink the cool purple wine, and to sing the songs of the years of Thang, until far into the night. More than once, Ming Yi thought of departing, but each time Si would begin, in that silver-sweet voice of hers, so wondrous a story of great poets, and the woman they loved, that he became entranced. Or she would sing a song so strange that all his senses seemed to die except the sense of hearing. The birds awakened, the flowers opened their eyes to the rising sun, and Ming Yi found himself, at last, compelled to bid his lovely enchantress farewell. Si, accompanying him to the terrace, kissed him fondly. Dear boy, she said, come as often as you can, as often as your heart whispers to you to come. I know that you are not one of those who betray secrets, yet, being so young, you might sometimes be thoughtless. I pray you never to forget that only the stars have been witnesses of our love. Speak of it to no living person, my dearest, and take with you this little remembrance of our happy night. And she presented him with an exquisite and curious little paperweight in the likeness of a couchant lion, wrought from jade as yellow as that created by the rainbow in honor of Kong Fu Tse. Tenderly, the boy kissed the gift and the beautiful hand that gave it. May the spirits punish me, he vowed, if ever I knowingly give you cause to reproach me. They separated with mutual vows, and that morning, on returning to the house of Lord Chang, Ming Yi told the first falsehood that had ever passed his lips. He said that his mother had asked him to pass his nights at home now that the weather had become so pleasant, for though the distance was somewhat long, he was strong and active and needed both the air and exercise. Chang believed all Ming Yi said and offered no objection. Accordingly, the youth was able to spend all his evenings at the house of the beautiful Si. Each night they devoted to the same pleasures that had made their first acquaintance so charming. They sang and conversed by turns. They played chess, the learned game invented by Wu Wang, which is an imitation of war. They composed poems of 80 rhymes on the flowers, the trees, the clouds, the streams, the birds, the bees. In all these accomplishments, Si far excelled her young sweetheart. Whenever they played chess, it was always Ming Yi's king, Ming Yi's Shang, who was surrounded and vanquished. When they composed verses, Si's poems were always superior to his in harmony, in elegance of form, in classic loftiness of thought. And the themes they selected were always the most difficult, those of the poets of the Tang dynasty. The songs they sang were also the songs of 500 years before, the songs of Yuan Qin, of Thao Mu, above all, of Cao, high poet and ruler of the province of Shichuan. So the summer waxed and waned upon their love, and the luminous autumn came with its vapors of phantom gold, its shadows of magical purple. Then it unexpectedly happened that Ming Yi's father met his son's employer, who asked him, "Why must your boy continue to travel to the city every evening, now that the winter is approaching? The way is long, and when he returns in the morning, he looks faint with weariness. Why not permit him to sleep in my house during the season of snow?" Ming Yi's father, greatly astonished, responded, "Sir, my son has not visited the city, nor has he been to our house all this summer. I fear that he must have acquired wicked habits, and that he passes his nights in evil company, perhaps in gaming or in drinking with the women of the flower boats." "No, that is not to be thought of," the High Commissioner said. "I have never found any evil in the boy, and there are no taverns or flower boats or places of dissipation in our neighborhood. No doubt Ming Yi has found some amiable youth with whom he spends his evenings, and has only told me an untruth for fear that I would not permit him to leave my residence. I beg you to say nothing to him until I try to discover this mystery. This very evening I will have my servant follow him and watch where he goes." Palu readily assented to this proposal, and promising to visit Chang the following morning, he returned home. That evening, when Ming Yi left the house of Chang, a servant followed him at a distance. But on reaching the most obscure portion of the road, the boy disappeared as suddenly as though the earth had swallowed him. After seeking him in vain, the servant returned home in great bewilderment and related what had taken place. Chang immediately sent a messenger to Palu. In the meantime, Ming Yi, entering the chamber of his beloved, was surprised and deeply pained to find her in tears. "Sweetheart," she sobbed, wreathing her arms around his neck, "we are about to be separated forever for reasons which I cannot tell you. I knew from the very first that this must come to pass. Nevertheless, it seems so cruelly sudden a loss, so unexpected a misfortune, that I cannot prevent myself from weeping. After tonight we shall never see each other again, my beloved. I know that you will never forget me while you live, but I know also that you will become a great scholar, and that honors and riches will be showered upon you, and that some beautiful and loving woman will console you for my loss. And now, let us speak no more of grief. Let us pass this night evening joyously, so that your recollection of me may not be painful, and you will remember my laughter rather than my tears." She brushed the bright tears away and brought wine and music and the melodious kin of 7 silken strings, and would not allow Ming Yi to speak of the coming separation. And she sang him an ancient song about the calmness of summer lakes, reflecting only the blue of heaven, and also about the calmness of the heart before the clouds of care and grief and weariness darken its little world. Soon they forgot their sorrow in the joy of song and wine, and those last hours seemed to Ming Yi more celestial than even the hours of their first bliss. When the yellow beauty of morning came, their sadness returned, and they wept. Once more, Sea accompanied her lover to the terrace steps, and as she kissed him farewell, she pressed into his hand a parting gift. A little brush case of agate, wonderfully chiseled and worthy of a great poet. And they separated forever, shedding many tears. Still Ming Yi could not believe it was an eternal parting. "No," he thought, "I shall visit her tomorrow, for I cannot live without her now, and surely she cannot refuse to receive me." Such were the thoughts that filled his mind as he reached the house of Chang, to find his father and his patron standing on the porch awaiting him. Before he could say a word, Palau demanded, "My son, where have you been passing your nights?" Seeing that his falsehood had been discovered, Ming Yi dared not reply, and remained abashed and silent, with bowed head in his father's presence. Then Palau, striking the boy violently, commanded him to divulge the secret. And at last, through fear of his father and also of the law, which ordains that the son refusing to obey his father shall be punished with 100 blows of the bamboo, Ming Yi stammered out the story of his love. Chang changed color at the boy's tale. Child, exclaimed the High Commissioner, I have no relative of the name of Ping. I have never heard of the woman you describe. I have never even heard of the house you speak of. But I know also that you would not dare to lie to your honored father. There is some strange delusion in this whole affair. Then Ming Yi produced the gifts that Si had given him, the line of yellow jade, the brush case of carved agate, also some original compositions by the beautiful lady herself. Chang's astonishment was now shared by Palau. Both observed that the brush case of agate and the jade line had the appearance of objects that had lain buried in the earth for centuries and were of a workmanship beyond the power of living man to imitate, while the compositions proved to be more veritable masterpieces of poetry in the style of the Tang dynasty. Friend Palau, cried the High Commissioner, let us immediately accompany the boy to the place where he obtained these miraculous things and apply the testimony of our senses to this mystery. The boy is no doubt telling the truth, yet his story passes my understanding. And all three proceeded toward the house of Si. When they had arrived at the shadiest part of the road, where the perfumes were sweetest and the mosses were greenest, and the fruits of the wild peach were the most pink, Ming Yi, gazing through the trees, uttered a cry of dismay. Where the azure tiled roof had risen against the sky, there was now only the empty blue air. Where the green and gold facade had been, there was only the flickering of leaves under the autumn light. And where the broad terrace had extended, only a ruin could be discerned. A tomb so ancient, so deeply gnawed by moss, that the name graven upon it was no longer decipherable. The home of Si had disappeared. Suddenly the High Commissioner smote his forehead with his hand and, turning to Palau, recited the well-known verse of the ancient poet Ching Kao. Surely the peach flowers blossom over the tomb of Si Thao. Friend Palau, continued Chang, the beauty who bewitched your son was none other than she whose tomb stands in ruins before us. Did she not say she was wedded to Ping Kang? There is no family of that name, but Ping Kang is indeed the name of a broad alley nearby in the city. There was a dark riddle in all she said. She called herself Si of Mount Hyo. There is no person of that name. There is no street of that name, but the Chinese characters Mon and Hyo placed together form the character Kyo. Listen, the alley Ping Kang, situated in the street Kyo, was the place where dwelt the great courtesans of the Tang dynasty. Did she not sing the songs of Cao Pian? And upon the brush case and the paperweight she gave your son, are there not characters which read, pure object of art belonging to Cao of the city of Fohai? That city no longer exists, yet the memory of Cao Pian remains, for he was governor of the province of Shi Chaoen and a mighty poet. And when he dwelt in the land of Chao, was not his favorite the beautiful wanton Si Thao, unmatched for grace among all the women of her day? It was he who made her a gift of those manuscripts. It was he who gave her those rare objects of art. Si Thao died, but not as other women die. Her limbs may have crumbled to dust, yet something of her still lives in this deep wood, and her shadow still haunts this shadowy place. Chang ceased to speak. A vague fear fell upon the three. The thin mists of the morning dimmed the green distance and deepened the ghostly beauty of the woods. A faint breeze passed by, leaving a trail of perfume, a last scent of dying flowers, thin as that which clings to the silk of a forgotten robe, and as it passed, the trees seemed to whisper across the silence, Si Thao. Fearing greatly of his son, Palau sent the youth away at once to the city of Quang Chao Fu. There, in later years, Ming Yi obtained high dignities and honors for his talents and his learning. He married the daughter of an illustrious house, by whom he became the father of sons and daughters famous for their virtues and accomplishments. Yet never could he forget Sethal, although it is said that he never spoke of her, not even when his children begged him to tell the story of two beautiful objects that always lay upon his writing table: a line of yellow jade and a brush case of carved agate. Alright, a short Russian tale, but it has all the necessary ingredients of a good fairy story. A wicked old woman who is also a stepmother, two young girls, one good and one bad, a talking dog, and a weak father who is afraid of his wife. The powerful spirit this time is the winter frost, who foils the witch's plot to kill the good and beautiful maiden. To complete the story, Frost is a king, and of course, when he marries the maiden, she is the queen. Evil dies, and all goes well forever after. This is the story of King Frost. Now, once upon a time, there was a peasant woman who had a daughter and a stepdaughter. The daughter had her own way in everything, and whatever she did was right in her mother's eyes. But the poor stepdaughter had a hard time. Whatever she did, she was always blamed and got small thanks for all the trouble she took. Nothing was right, everything wrong, and yet, if the truth were known, the girl was so unselfish and good-hearted, she was worth her weight in gold. Nevertheless, her stepmother hated her, and the poor girl's days were spent in weeping, for it was impossible to live peacefully with the woman. Now the wicked stepmother was determined to get rid of the girl and kept saying to her father, "Send her away, old man. Send her away, anywhere, so that my eyes won't be plagued by the sight of her, or my ears tormented by the sound of her voice. Send her out into the fields and let the frost do for her." In vain the poor old father wept and implored her pity. She was firm, and he could not withstand her. So he placed his daughter in a sleigh, not even daring to give her a blanket to warm her, and drove her out into the open fields. There he kissed her and left her, driving home as fast as he could, so that he would not witness her miserable death. Deserted by her father, the poor girl sat down under a fir tree at the edge of the forest and began to weep. Suddenly she heard a faint sound. It was Frost King, springing from tree to tree and cracking his fingers as he went. At length he reached the fir tree, and with a crisp crackling sound he alighted beside her and looked at her lovely face. "Well, maiden," he snapped out, "do you know who I am? I am King Frost, King of the Red Noses." "Hail to you, great king," answered the girl in a gentle, trembling voice. "Have you come to take me?" "Are you warm, maiden?" he replied. "Quite warm, King Frost," she answered, although she shivered as she spoke. Then King Frost stooped down and bent over the girl, and the crackling sound grew louder, and the air seemed to be full of knives and darts. Again he asked, "Maiden, are you warm? Are you warm, beautiful girl?" And though her breath was almost frozen on her lips, she whispered gently, "Quite warm, King Frost." Then King Frost gnashed his teeth and cracked his fingers, and his eyes sparkled, and the crackling, crisp sound was louder than ever. And for the last time he asked her, "Maiden, are you still warm? Are you still warm, little love?" And the poor girl was so stiff and numb that she could just gasp, "Still warm, O king." Now her gentle, courteous words and her uncomplaining ways touched King Frost, and he had pity on her, and wrapped her in furs. Then he fetched a great box in which her beautiful jewels and a rich robe embroidered in gold and silver. She put it on and looked lovelier than ever, and King Frost drew her into his sleigh, drawn by 6 white horses. In the meantime, the wicked stepmother was waiting at home for news of the girl's death, and preparing pancakes for the funeral feast. At last she said to her husband, "Old man, you had better go out into the field and find your daughter's body and bury her." Just as the old man was leaving, the little dog under the table began to bark, saying, "Your daughter shall live to be your delight. Her daughter shall die this very night." "Hold your tongue, you foolish beast," scolded the woman. "Here's a pancake for you, but first you must say, 'Her daughter shall have much silver and gold. His daughter is frozen quite stiff and cold.'" But the dog ate up the pancake and barked instead. "His daughter shall wear a crown on her head. Her daughter shall die unwooed, unwed." The old woman tried to coax the dog with more pancakes and then to terrify him with blows, but he always barked the same words. Suddenly the door creaked and flew open. A great heavy chest was pushed in, and behind it came the stepdaughter, radiantly beautiful in a dress all glittering with silver and gold. For a moment the stepmother's eyes were dazzled. Then she called to her husband, "Old man, yoke the horses to the sleigh at once and take my daughter to the same field and leave her on the same spot exactly." The old man took the girl and left her beneath the same tree where he had parted from his daughter. In a few minutes King Frost came along, and looking at the girl he said, "Are you warm, maiden?" "What a blind old fool you must be to ask such a question," she answered angrily. "Can't you see that my hands and feet are nearly frozen?" Then King Frost sprang to and fro, questioning her and getting only rude words in reply, till at last he got very angry, and he cracked his fingers and gnashed his teeth and froze her to death. In the hut her mother was waiting for her return, and growing impatient, she said to her husband, "Get out the horses, old man, and go fetch her home, but be careful not to upset the sleigh and lose the chest." But the dog beneath the table began to bark, saying, "Your daughter is frozen quite stiff and cold, and shall never have a chest full of gold." "Don't tell such wicked lies," scolded the woman. "There's a cake for you. Now say, 'Her daughter shall marry a mighty king.'" At that moment the door flew open, and she rushed out to meet her daughter. And as she took the frozen girl in her arms, she too was chilled to death. All right, now this here is a story from East India of an intrepid man who, though he was king, loved adventure and did not fear hardship. His favorite sport was hunting, and through this he was led by a white stag to discover an old hermit who foretold a future for the king's daughter, which the king did not like. He determined to prevent it, and he devoted all his life to this determination. Yet he could not succeed. How he tried and how he failed leads nevertheless to a happy ending. This is the story of the king who would be stronger than fate. Once upon a time, far away in the East Country, there lived a king who loved hunting so much that once there was a deer in sight, he was careless of his own safety. Often he became separated from his nobles and attendants, and in fact, he was particularly fond of lonely adventures. Another of his favorite amusements was to announce that he was indisposed and could not be seen. Then, with the knowledge only of his faithful Grand Vizier, he would disguise himself as a peddler, load a donkey with cheap wares, and travel about. In this way, he found out what the common people were saying about him and how his judges and governors fulfilled their duties. One day his queen presented him with a baby daughter as beautiful as the dawn, and the king was so happy and delighted that for a whole week he forgot to hunt and spent the time in public and private rejoicing. Not long afterward, however, he went out after some deer which were to be found in a far corner of his forest. During the hunt, his dogs discovered a beautiful snow-white stag, and as soon as the king saw it, he determined to have it at any cost. He spurred his horse and pursued the stag as hard as he could gallop, Of course, all his attendants followed as best they could, but the king was so splendidly mounted, and the stag was so swift, that at the end of an hour the king and his favorite hound were alone. All the rest were far, far behind and out of sight. Nothing daunted, he went on until he perceived that he was entering a valley with great rocky mountains on all sides, and that his horse was tired and trembled at every stride. Evening was drawing on, and the sun would soon set. In vain he had sent arrow after arrow at the beautiful stag. Every shot fell short, and at last, as darkness was setting in, he lost sight of the beast altogether. By this time his horse could scarcely move from fatigue, and his hound was panting beside him. He was far away in mountains he had never seen before, and not a human creature or dwelling was in sight. All this very discouraging, but the king would not have minded had he not lost the beautiful stag. But he was not one to worry long over what he could not help, so he got down from his horse and led it along the rough path in the hope of discovering some shepherd's hut, or at least a cave or shelter where he might pass the night. Presently he heard the sound of rushing water and made toward it. He soon came to a stream, and there he saw an old hermit with a long white beard. He neither spoke nor moved as the king approached, but sat throwing into the stream the dry leaves which lay scattered about the ground near him. "Peace be upon you," said the king, giving the usual country salutation. "And upon you, peace," answered the hermit. But still, he never looked up or stopped what he was doing. For a minute or two, the king stood watching him. He noticed that the hermit threw 2 leaves in at a time and gazed at them attentively. Sometimes both were carried rapidly down by the stream. Sometimes only one leaf was carried off, and the other, after whirling slowly round on the edge of the current, would come circling back to the hermit's feet. At other times, both leaves were held in the backward eddy and failed to reach the main current. "What are you doing?" asked the king at last. The hermit replied that he was reading the fates of men. Everyone's fate, he said, was settled from the beginning, and whatever it was, there was no escape from it. The king laughed. "I care little what my fate may be, but I should be curious to know the fate of my little daughter." "I cannot say," the hermit answered. "Do you not know, then?" said the king. "Perhaps," said the hermit, "but it is not always wisdom to know too much." The king was not content with this, and began to press the old man to tell what he knew, which for a long time he would not do. At last, however, the king urged him so greatly that he yielded. "The king's daughter," he said, "will marry the son of a poor slave girl called Peruna, who belongs to the king of the land of the north. There is no escaping fate." The king was wild with anger at these words, but he was also very tired, so he only laughed and said that he hoped there might be a way out of that fate. He asked the hermit to shelter him and his beasts for the night, then watered and tethered his horse, and after a supper of bread and parched peas, lay down in the cave, the hound at his feet, and tried to sleep. But he only lay awake and thought of the hermit's prophecy. And the more he thought of it, the angrier he felt, until he gnashed his teeth and declared that it must never come to pass. Morning came, and the king got up, pale and sulky. After learning from the hermit which path to take, he soon mounted and found his way home without difficulty. Directly he reached his palace, he wrote a letter to the king of the land of the north, begging him as a favor to sell him his slave girl Peruna and her son, and saying that if he consented, he would send a messenger to receive them at the river which divided their kingdoms. For 5 days he awaited the reply and hardly slept or ate, but was as cross as could be all the time. On the 6th day his messenger returned with a letter saying that the king of the land of the north would not sell the slave girl and her son, but would give them to him. The king was overjoyed. He sent for his grand vizier and told him that he was going on one of his solitary expeditions and to invent some excuse for his absence. Next, he disguised himself as an ordinary messenger, mounted a swift camel, and sped away to the place where the slave girl was to be handed over to him. When he got there, he gave the messengers who brought her a letter of thanks and a handsome present for their master and rewards for themselves. Then he lifted the poor woman and her baby boy onto his camel and rode off to a wild desert. After riding for a day and a night with scarcely a stop, he came to a great cave where he made the woman dismount, and taking her and the baby into the cave, he drew his sword and with one blow chopped her head off. But although his anger at the prophecy had made him cruel, still the king could not turn his great sword on the helpless baby, who he was sure must soon die in this deserted place without its mother. So he left it in the cave, and mounting his camel, he rode home as fast as he could. Now, in a small village in his kingdom, there lived an old widow who had no children or relations of any kind. She made her living mostly by selling goat's milk, but she was very poor and not very strong, and she often wondered how she would live if she became too weak or ill to tend her goats. Every morning she drove them out into the desert to graze on the shrubs and bushes that grew there, and every evening they came home by themselves to be milked and shut up safely for the night. One evening the old woman was astonished to find that her very best nanny goat had returned without a drop of milk. She thought that some naughty boy or girl had played a trick on her and had caught the goat on its way home and drunk the milk. But when evening after evening the goat returned from pasture almost dry, she determined to discover the thief. So one day she followed the goats and watched them while they grazed. At length in the afternoon, the old woman noticed this particular nanny goat stealing away from the herd, and at once she went after her. The goat walked for some distance and then disappeared into a cave. The old woman followed, and then what should she see but the goat feeding her milk to a baby boy, while on the ground nearby lay the remains of the baby's dead mother. Wondering and frightened, the old woman decided at last that this baby could be a son to her in her old age, and that he would grow up and become her comfort and support. She carried the baby home to her hut, and next day she took a spade to the cave and dug a grave for the poor mother. Years passed by, and the baby grew into a fine lad, as brave as he was handsome, and as industrious as he was brave. The old woman had named him Nur Muhammad. One day, when he was about 17 years old, he was coming home from his day's work in the fields when he saw a strange donkey eating the cabbages in their little cottage garden. Seizing a big stick, he began to beat the intruder to drive him out of his garden. A neighbor passing by called out, "Ho there! Why are you beating the peddler's donkey? The peddler should keep him from eating my cabbages. If he comes again, I'll cut off his tail for him," Nur Muhammad said, and he went indoors whistling cheerfully. It happened that this neighbor was a mischief maker, so meeting the peddler that evening in the sarai, or inn, he told him what had occurred and added, "Yes, and he said that if the donkey came again, he would beat you too and cut your nose off for a thief." A few days later, when the peddler had moved on, two men appeared in the village inquiring who it was who had threatened to ill-treat an innocent peddler. They declared that the peddler, in fear of his life, had complained to the king and that they had been sent to bring the lawless person before the king himself. Of course, they soon found out about the donkey eating Nur Muhammad's cabbages and about the young man's hot words, although the lad assured them that he had never threatened to murder anyone. Nevertheless, they had orders to arrest him, and so, in spite of his protests and the wails of his foster mother, he was carried off and in due time brought before the king. As for Nur Muhammad, he did not guess that the supposed peddler had been none other than the king himself, nor did anyone else. The king was very angry, and he declared that he was going to make an example of this young man and teach him that even poor traveling peddlers could get justice in his country and be protected from such lawlessness. Just as he was going to pronounce a heavy sentence, there was a stir in the court, and up came Nur Muhammad's old foster mother, weeping and lamenting and begging to be heard. The king ordered her to speak, and she began to plead for the boy, declaring how good he was and how he was the support of her old age, and if he were put in prison, she would die. When the king asked who she was, she replied that she was the boy's mother. "His mother," said the king. "You are too old, surely, to have so young a son." Then, in her frightened distress, the old woman confessed the whole story of how she had found the baby and rescued him and brought him up. And she ended by beseeching the king for mercy. As the story came out, the king looked blacker and blacker and more grim, until at last he was almost stupefied with rage and astonishment. Here then was the baby he had left to die, after cruelly murdering his mother. Surely fate might have spared him for this. He wished he had sufficient excuse to put the boy to death, for the old hermit's prophecy came back to him as strongly as ever. And yet the young man had done nothing bad enough to deserve such a punishment. Everyone would call him a tyrant if he were to give such an order. In fact, he dared not try it. At length he collected himself enough to speak. "If he will enlist in my army, I will let him off. We have need of men like him, and a little discipline will do him good." Still the old woman pleaded that she could not live without her son, and was nearly as terrified at the idea of his becoming a soldier as of him being put in prison. But at length the king, who was determined to get the youth into his clutches, promised her a pension large enough to keep her in comfort, and Nur Muhammad, to his own great delight, was duly enrolled in the king's army. As a soldier, Nur Muhammad felt himself to be in luck. He was surprised but rather pleased to find that he was always one of those chosen for any difficult or dangerous enterprise, and although sometimes he had the narrowest escapes, still the dangers he underwent gave him special chances to display his courage. As he was also modest and generous, he became a favorite with his officers and comrades. Thus, it was not surprising that before very long he found himself among the picked men of the king's bodyguard. The fact is that the king had hoped the boy would be killed in some fight or other, but as on the contrary he throve on hard knocks, the king was now determined to try more direct methods. Now one day, soon after Nur Muhammad had entered the bodyguard, he was selected to be one of the king's escort through the city. Now the procession was marching along when a man armed with a dagger rushed out of an alley straight toward the king. Nur Muhammad threw himself in the man's path and received the stab that had apparently been intended for the king. Luckily, the thrust had been hurried, and the dagger glanced off his breastbone. Although he was severely wounded, his youth and strength quickly overcame it. The king was obliged to take notice of this brave deed, and as a reward made him one of his own attendants. After this, the strange adventures the young man passed through were endless. Officers of the bodyguard were often sent on secret and difficult errands, which had a curious way of becoming necessary when Nur Muhammad was on duty. Once, while he was on journey, a footbridge gave way under him. Once he was attacked by armed robbers. A rock rolled down on him in a mountain pass. A heavy stone coping fell from a roof and just missed him in a narrow city alley. He realized that he must have an enemy, but he was lighthearted, and the thought did not much trouble him. Somehow he escaped every time and was amused rather than anxious about the next adventure. It was the custom of that court that the guard officer on duty should receive all his food direct from the king's kitchen. Now one day, when Nur Muhammad was on duty, he was just sitting down to a delicious stew when a hungry dog poked his nose in at the open guardroom door and looked at Nur Muhammad with his mouth watering. The kind-hearted young man picked out a lump of meat and threw it to the dog. The dog pounced on it and gulped it down greedily, and was just turning to go when he staggered, fell, rolled over, and died. Nur Muhammad, who had been lazily watching, stood still for a moment. Then he came back whistling softly. He gathered up the rest of his dinner and carefully wrapped it up to carry away and bury somewhere, and then he sent back the empty plates. How furious the king was when at the next morning's durbar, Nur Muhammad appeared before him, alert and smiling as usual. He was determined, however, to try once more, and bade the young man come into his presence that evening, when he gave orders for him to carry a secret dispatch to the governor of a distant province. "Make your preparations at once," he added, "and be ready to start in the morning. I myself will deliver the papers to you at the last moment." Now, this province was 4 or 5 days' journey from the palace, and its governor was the king's most faithful servant. He could be silent as the grave, and he prided himself on his obedience. And his wife had been almost a mother to the young princess ever since the queen had died some years earlier. It just happened that the princess had recently been sent away for her health to another remote province, and the governor's wife had begged her to come and stay with them as soon as she could. The princess accepted gladly and was actually staying in the governor's house at the very time when the king made up his mind to send Nur Muhammad there with the mysterious dispatch. According to orders, Nur Muhammad presented himself early the next morning at the king's private apartments. With his best horse saddled, food in his saddlebag, and money tied up in his waistband, he was ready to start. Now the king handed him a sealed packet, charging him to give it only into the hands of the governor and to no one else. Nur Muhammad hid it carefully in his turban, swung himself into the saddle, and 5 minutes later rode out of the city gates, and set out on his long journey. The weather was very hot, but Nur Muhammad thought that the sooner his precious letter was delivered, the better. By dint of riding most of each night and resting only in the hottest part of the day, he found himself approaching his destination by noon on the third day. Not a soul was to be seen anywhere, and Nur Muhammad, stiff, thirsty, and tired, looked longingly over the wall into the gardens at the fountains, the green grass, the shady apricot orchards, and giant mulberry trees, and wished he were there. At length he reached the castle gates, and a soldier admitted him at once, for he wore the uniform of the king's bodyguard. The governor was resting, the soldier said, and could not see him until the evening. Nur Muhammad handed over his horse to an attendant and wandered into the lovely gardens he had seen from the road and sat down in the shade to rest. He flung himself on his back and watched the birds twittering in the trees above him. Through the branches he could see great patches of sky where the kites wheeled and circled incessantly with shrill whistling cries. The bees buzzing about the flowers made a soothing sound, and in a few minutes Nur Muhammad was fast asleep. Every day in the heat of the afternoon, the governor and his wife would lie down for 2 or 3 hours, and so, for that matter, did most people in the palace. But the princess, restless like many other girls, preferred to wander about the gardens rather than rest on a pile of soft cushions. What a torment her stout old attendants and servants thought when she insisted on staying awake and making them talk and amuse her, when they could hardly keep their eyes open. Sometimes, however, the princess would pretend to sleep, and then, after all her women had gladly followed her example, she would get up and go out by herself, her veil hanging loosely about her. When she was discovered, her old hostess scolded her, but the princess only laughed and did the same thing next time. This very afternoon the princess had left all her women asleep and had slipped out into the great garden to ramble about in all her favorite nooks and corners, feeling quite safe, as there was not a creature to be seen. Suddenly, on turning a corner, she stopped in surprise, for before her lay a man fast asleep. In her haste, she had almost tripped over him, this young man, tanned and dusty with travel, in the uniform of the king's guard. Out of a fold of the young man's turban peeped the corner of a letter. One of the few faults of this lovely princess was a devouring curiosity, and she lived such an idle life that she had plenty of time to be curious. She wondered what was in it and whom it was for. She drew her veil a little closer, stole up on tiptoe, and caught hold of the corner of the letter. Then she pulled it a little, and just a little more. A great seal came into view, which she recognized as her father's, and at the sight of it she paused for a minute, half ashamed of what she was doing. But the pleasure of taking a letter which was not meant for her was more than she could resist, and in another moment it was in her hand. All at once she remembered that it would be death for this poor officer if he lost the letter, and soon, at all hazards, she must put it back again. And this would not be so easy. But how she burned with longing to read it and see what was inside. She examined the seal. It was sticky from exposure to the hot sun, and with very little effort it parted from the paper. The letter was open, and she read it. And this was what was written. Behead the messenger who brings this letter, secretly and at once. Ask no questions. The girl grew pale. What a shame, she thought. She would not let a handsome young fellow like that be beheaded. Yet, how to prevent it was not quite clear at the moment. Some plan must be invented, and she wished to lock herself in where no one could interrupt her, as might easily happen in the garden. She crept softly to her room and took a piece of paper and wrote upon it, "Marry the messenger who brings this letter to the princess, openly and at once. Ask no questions." She even contrived to work the seals off the original letter and to fix them to the new one, so that no one could tell that this was not the original letter. Then, shaking with fear and excitement, she slipped back to where the young officer still lay asleep, thrust the letter into his turban, and hurried back to her room. It was done. Late in the afternoon, Nur Muhammad woke, and making sure that the precious dispatch was still safe, went off to get ready for his audience with the governor. As soon as he was ushered into his presence, he placed the letter in the governor's hands according to orders. When he had read it to the governor, When he had read it, the governor was certainly a little astonished, but he had been told to ask no questions, and he knew how to obey orders. He sent for his wife and told her to get the princess ready to be married at once. "Nonsense," said his wife. "What in the world do you mean?" "That is the king's command," he answered. "Go and do as I bid you. The letter says at once, and ask no questions. The marriage, therefore, must take place this very evening." In vain his wife urged every objection. The more she urged, the more determined was her husband. "I know how to obey orders," he said, "and they are as plain as the nose on my face." So the princess was summoned, and somewhat to their surprise, she seemed to take the news very calmly. Next, Nur Muhammad was informed, and he was greatly startled, but of course delighted at the unexpected honor which he thought the king had done him. Then all the castle was turned upside down, and when the news spread in the town, that turned upside down too. Everybody ran everywhere and tried to do everything at once. And in the middle of it all, the old governor went about with his hair standing on end, muttering something about obeying orders. The marriage was celebrated, and there was a great feast in the castle, and another in the soldiers' barracks, with illuminations all over the town and in the beautiful gardens. All the people declared that such a wonderful sight had never been seen, and they talked about it to the ends of their lives. The next day, the governor dispatched the princess and her bridegroom to the king with a troop of horsemen, splendidly dressed, and he sent a mounted messenger on before them with a letter giving the king the account of the marriage. When the king got the letter, he grew so red in the face that everyone thought he would have apoplexy. All were very anxious to know what had happened, but he rushed off and locked himself into a room, where he roared and raved until he was tired. After a while, he began to think he had better make the best of it, especially as the old governor had been clever enough to send him back his own letter as well. And the king was quite sure that he recognized the princess's handwriting. Whatever his daughter had done, he did not wish to cut her head off, nor did he want people to know the truth because it would make him look foolish. In fact, the more he considered the matter, the more he felt that he would be wise to put a good face on it and to let people think that the marriage was his own idea. When the young couple arrived, therefore, the king received them with all state and gave his son-in-law a province to govern. Nur Muhammad soon proved himself as able and honorable a governor as he was a brave soldier. And when the old king died, he became king in his place, and reigned long and happily. Nur Muhammad's old mother lived for a long time in her son's palace and died in peace. The princess, although she had got her husband by a trick, found that she could not trick him, and so she never tried, but busied herself by teaching her children and scolding her maids. As for the old hermit, no further trace of him was ever discovered. But the cave is there, and the leaves lie thick in front of it to this day.